And now on Oprah Radio.
It's the Dr. Laura Berman Show.
We've been talking about sort of letting go of your thinking brain and letting your natural GPS sometimes take over, and not to let go completely of weighing the consequences. So you do something illegal or, or going to get you into trouble or in a car accident or something. But, sometimes letting go of having to know, because first of all, you can't know. I mean, you can guess, but you can't really know what the future is going to hold. And there's a bajillion possibilities at every split second if you really want to think about the consequences. So I want to get just with Alicia's situation, her big question that she was saying over the break, Dr. Pillay, is like, all right, so she did this kind of impulsive act, this impulsive, brain GPS driven act of reaching out and going to see her grandmother. And she hasn't been able to even talk about it basically until now. And now, she's aware that it's percolating in there. It wants to come out, but she doesn't know what does she do now?
So I think there are a number of different things. So just to sort of reemphasize what we were talking about earlier, I think that for people whose fundamental nature is to be too impulsive, and what that would mean is that their impulsivity gets them into trouble.
Yeah.
I think that engaging the thinking brain can be helpful. I think for someone like Alicia, where she feels, and it sounds like that sometimes her thinking brain gets in the way of other experiences that she could enjoy, engaging this emotional brain could actually be to her advantage. So I think it's a question of weighing what your fundamental nature is and then making a decision about what you want to engage.
And that there's a balance. So if we had to give a percentage, how much should be, in an ideal world, how much should be the thinking brain and how much should be the kind of emotional, letting your internal GPS do the work in an ideal world, do you think?
I think it really depends on the situation, because I think, for example, if you're driving a car versus having an orgasm, and hopefully you're not doing both at the same time.
No, that would be hard. Unless you're stuck in traffic for a really long time.
Right. But if you're doing that, if you're having an orgasm, you want much more of the emotional brain to be at play. If you're driving a car, you want your emotional brain to be aware.
But so then that brings me back to Alicia, because her life experience, it has been, you get into, bad things can happen and do happen. And so to her, it feels like she's having an orgasm while driving. You know what I mean? Or she's trying, it feels that unsafe to her.
It's a catch-22 situation.
Yeah.
So here's one of the paradigms that I think is sometimes helpful in these catch-22 situations. In general, what happens is when people are excessively, and when I use words like excessive, I'm not talking about a norm. I mean relative to what you think you want to have to make your life happier. So when people are excessively afraid of a consequence, of an emotional consequence or letting go, what ends up happening is that they bias the attentional brain. So in general, the fear center and the attentional center in the brain connect. And the fear center, what you're afraid of, affects what you attend to. So if you have a heightened degree of awareness of negative consequences, it basically makes your brain search for threat. It basically says, and so you find more negative things, not because more negative things exist, but because your fear is drawing your attention to that.
I like that heightened awareness of potential negative consequences.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, for so many people, I often will hear, especially in this day and age with the economic situation being as it is, people will say, oh, look what's going on. There's so many horrible things. Are you asking me not to be a realist? And my answer is yes. I am definitely asking you not to be a realist. And the reason is that if you really want to think about all the horrible things that are happening in the world, you can basically fill up the cup of your attentional center in your brain right to the brim, and your cup will just be filled with negative experiences. What you have to do is take charge of your own situation and say to yourself, on any particular day, how much do I want to fill up the cup of my attention with negative consequences? And how much do I want to fill it with positive thoughts? And people will generally object to this if they say, well, the negative stuff feels real. And I think they confuse real for automatic. The negative stuff may be automatic because your prior experience was negative. But it's not any more real than the positive stuff. It's just that what you haven't done is broken the cycle by letting your attention essentially be directed toward positive things. So rather than waiting for that one fine day when you might actually want to start attending to something positive, put the thinking brain into gear first and say, in Alicia's case, she uses her thinking brain extremely well.
Yes.
So one of the things I would say to someone like Alicia is, you have great control of your thinking brain, so teach and practice. Teach your thinking brain to attend to all of the positive things that happened in that one situation. So right now, I think it's perfectly acceptable if your brain's in shock. Right now, your emotional brain is basically thumping its chest, and your thinking brain is sort of saying,
"What the heck happened?"
Right, exactly. And so you're inside, your brain is
I love that little emotional brain.
Right, right. It's a great brain, especially in Alicia's case, because the emotional brain is promising you something that you haven't had up until this point. Because probably after those initial points of pain or hurt, your thinking brain decided it wanted to just take over from any emotion, because why process a lot of that pain? So I think when you saw your grandmother, the two things were happening: the joy of remembering the beauty of that, and the pain of processing not having seen her for such a long time. And so your brain is thrown into a state of confusion, and there is some recovery time that's needed. What I would say is, once you come off of that intense conflict phase, it's important to then say, well, since my forte is essentially paying attention to things and thinking things, what I'd like to do is then start thinking about positive things in that particular situation. Like, what was great? For example, one of the greatest things about that situation was that you overrode your brain's default state. I mean, you demonstrated to yourself that you are capable of overriding your brain's default state so that your brain can cooperate with your deepest intentions and bring you towards something. That's an extremely positive thing. For so many of us, we're sort of paralyzed in this situation of fear, and we're unable to move toward what we want. And what you've done is you've taken some step toward confronting your fears. And I think in this kind of situation, we often do catastrophize this. People will say things like, "Oh, I'm going to have a nervous breakdown," when they get emotional. And I will often respond with, "Oh, you mean build up?" And they'll say, what do you mean? And I'll say, if you're expressing your emotions, it doesn't necessarily correlate with breaking down. Sometimes expressing your emotions is a way of building up. And so I think if you can start to teach yourself this other way of looking at things, if you can say to yourself, in my case, coming to terms with these emotions, having these intense emotions, if I suddenly cry and I don't know why, if I suddenly find myself moved, this is actually part of my rebuilding something that I might have neglected to give myself for all of these years. Because eventually, when you give yourself the permission to be emotional, what you're doing is giving yourself the permission to find a whole new way of living your life.
Right. And that's not to say you're not capable. And when you say of being emotional, that's not to say that you're not capable of emotions, because she definitely is.
No,
she gets touched by things, moved by things. But it's about not allowing that part of your brain to have a say.
You can hear the Dr. Laura Berman Show every weekday on Oprah Radio at XM 156 and Sirius 195. Check Oprah.com for showtimes.
Live your best life on Oprah Radio.